Hello and welcome to another Unclecthulu reviews. Today it's not about models, it's a bit of our history, alternative history thoughts. So at the weekend I managed to go to visit the Culloden battlefield. It's a really interesting battlefield. National Trust has done some really interesting things there. For example, the flags laying out where the two lines were at the start of the engagement. Visitor centre is really excellent. And yeah, it was really interesting visit, and we took a battlefield tour. It was only an extra £2, but the guide really helped talk about the battle and make things come alive. So it's a long drive back down from Inverness to Wimsby. So I had a good thought about, could the Jacobites have won or done anything more significant during the 45? Now with war is generally won by the side with the most economic power and population to leverage that. Certainly World War II, World War One, and Civil War, all our major wars have been the side with the most economic power. Occasionally the weaker side in terms of economy or size of country will have some quite early and dramatic victories. However, in the long run, the side with the most economic might will pull it back. Certainly off the top of my head, I can only really think of the American War of Independence, where the Americans were able to hold the British. The British were held back with their massive supply lines, and certainly it was the French towards the end of the conflict which really helped the Americans claim victory and their independence. So we'll come then to the Jacobites. Bonnie Prince Charlie didn't want to take a French army onto British soil. He wanted to have the people spontaneously support him and anoint him as king of the land. Essentially, it was a dynastic struggle between two branches of relations. Certainly, the deposed sons of James versus the Protestant sons of Hanover who were fighting for the British crown. I have the suspicion that in most of these battles and wars, the people didn't really care. Whoever was on the throne didn't make that much difference to people like you and me. There was a slight religious element to it, as the war in Europe at the time was generally split across religious grounds, with Catholic France holding one side and Protestant Germans on the other. And you'd just seen some quite major battles and wars in Europe as well. So France would have wanted a Catholic monarch on the throne, and the English nobility and people that ran the country certainly wanted to keep it Protestant. So that was it. So Bonnie Prince Charlie came, I think he came to Scotland with 7 men when he first raised his standard at Glenshiel. And his initial force comprised 1,500 Highlanders. Now the garrison in Scotland had gone north was based at Fort Augustus, so quickly Charles moved south, started threatening Edinburgh. Then the government army was brought down the coast south of Edinburgh to engage him, and we had the first engagement, Prestonpans. Prestonpans basically meant that the British Army government force was defeated in Scotland, and it was a victory within 5 minutes for the Jacobites. However, even though Bonnie Prince Charlie had Scotland in the palm of his hands, he couldn't invest, where he couldn't capture Stirling, Edinburgh Castle, Dumbarton, as well as a few other garrisons. However, he thought his best chance now was to go to London, and he believed that there would be spontaneous uprisings in support of him on the way down. So off he marched. Carlisle was the first major town in England. It's a major fortification. It was held by invalids who were prepared to stand a siege. but Charles threatened to burn the town and deal harshly with the population. Now this actually goes against a lot of Charles's ethos. He'd give the troops. He wanted to be king. He knew he was king of the Britain, so he didn't want his army hurting the British people. And he wanted the British people to proclaim him as a great and glorious king. The reason he probably did was Cumberland's army was in Newcastle threatening to come, it might have been Wade's army, was in Newcastle and threatening to stop his advance. He needed to take Carlisle quickly. However, I believe this would work against him, as rumours would go around that he threatened to burn and kill people. It would add to the propaganda that the government had already set up against him. However, marching south, at one point he had a feint to draw off an army to Wales, leaving the road from Derby to London unguarded. Now we have the famous point at that point where there's a council of war, and his generals, because there haven't been a mass uprising in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie, wants him to return north, wants him to go back to Scotland and take and hold Scotland. I think this is a critical point, and if the Jacobite rebellion of 45 was going to be significantly different, it hinges on this point. And I think if Charles had marched on London, things could have been different, and it was his only opportunity to win or create a different outcome. Now, the reason he didn't, like I said before, was the uprising hadn't occurred. The people didn't come out in support of him. But also there was rumours of a third army. There was Marshal Wade's army, there was the Duke of Cumberland's army, and this third army which was in London. Now a lot of people say that army didn't exist. I would argue that it did, and it would have numbered about 10,000. It was the trained bands of London plus whatever other garrison forces which were left in London. So it's not a great army, it's not a professional army, but it was an army that could go to the field. Certainly during the English Civil War, we saw the first Parliamentary Army defeated at Edge Hill. They fall back, Essex goes to London, rallies the trained men, and the trained men, the remains of his army, stand before the king, and the king decides not to fight the army to advance on London, and the king goes back to Oxford. So if Bonnie Prince Charlie had gone to London, the trained bands would have came out of London to oppose him. George II was actually contemplating commanding this army. I think this would have been a critical engagement, and I think the Highlanders would have butchered this army if it stood against them, which would have given them further morale, impetus, and more people would have thought that they were the winning side. War is impetus, the actual on the ground, the operational impetus, keep moving, keep going. Certainly at Derby, the Highland Army hadn't really been defeated. They had a great win under the belt, and I think they could have taken the army. Now London didn't have any defences, so Charlie could have gone straight into London. If the train bands hadn't formed, however, I believe the Tower of London would have been defended, and as I said before, the Jacobites had real trouble in taking and capturing castles. So we have a hypothetical engagement then before London, and King George would have been commanding. If they had been defeated, the trained bands, George's army, which I believe it would have done, it wouldn't necessarily meant that George would have been captured. Certainly even at the end of Culloden, Bonnie Prince Charlie was able to retreat off with his cavalry. I believe the king would have been taken to safety. Even if the king had been in London and there was no battle before London, the prince would have marched into London, the king would have been whisked to safety, at the very least, get him in the Tower of London, get him safe, whilst the Duke of Cumberland and Marshal Wade could have combined their forces, 20,000 men, and dealt with the Jacobites in London. certainly if the government weren't able to hold London against a Jacobite army wouldn't have been able to hold London against 20,000 redcoats. So then we've got the point of Charles is in London. He wouldn't have been able to form a government whilst there were two field armies still in the field against him. Now his generals were really reticent about taking the field against British armies that outnumbered them. And certainly Cumberland and Wade had about 10,000 men each. But the army would have just defeated the trained bands of London and Trestapans. The Jacobite army was fighting in a way that the redcoats weren't ready for. The charge, the Highland charge, was the best that they had going, and Charles would have had to have left a portion of troops in London to hold London and met and defeated in detail the government armies. And certainly I suspect if he'd have been able to pull a victory off against one of the other two forces, either Cumberland or Wade, at this point, whilst he's got a garrison in London, that's when the British government would have fallen. Certainly there were rumours of a French invasion force coming along to help Charles, and if he could have defeated one of the two principal field armies and held London with French support coming, he would have been king. Now there's a lot of ifs there, and obviously Charles listened to his advisors and went north, which highlighted another problem of the Jacobite army. No one head at the top. It was an army of different clan chiefs. There were some French regiments. Certainly after they were retreated back to Scotland, they were joined by some Irish forces. It was an alliance, and Charles never commanded it. And without a definite commander at the top with a definite strategy and his vision going through the forces, there was no way that the army could have achieved anything whilst the Hydra was at the top, pulling different ways. Without a clear control and a general defining the will of an army's never going to achieve much. So ultimately, Derby, in my mind, was a turning point. I think the Jacobite army going up against General Wade's or Duke of Cumberland's army after a potentially taking of London, still think that would have been a hard fought thing, which the Jacobites were it wouldn't have been an easy win if it was a win. The government army was a lot more trained, but they hadn't been drilled as much as the government army which went to Culloden. Certainly see this by the fact that the front line at Culloden held. Even the two regiments that were engaged heavily by the Highlanders basically held and allowed the second line to form up around it. The battle before Culloden, Battle of Falkirk, was tactical draw, probably a Jacobite strategic victory. And again, the Jacobites weren't able to exploit the advantages of the charge and overwhelm a line and force an army en masse to break. Certainly, I firmly believe if the trained bands of London had came out, the trained bands would have been broken by a Highland charge, but a Redcoat regular army, I think you're asking a lot there. So Derby going to London would have been Charles's last chance to force a resolution which was different to the one that occurred. Certainly, beyond that, I can't see anything. I can't see any other resolution happening. By the time you get to Culloden, the Highland Rebellion, the Jacobite rebellion's finished. It's over. It's a last gasp effort. In another video, I actually talked about Culloden, and whilst I think the war was decided by then, I still think the Highlanders could have done a lot more to have gained a resolution. But thanks for listening. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Jacobite rebellion. Do you believe Charlie could have done it? Or do you think it's doomed for failure and just a romantic notion of Charles being able to do it? But thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.